orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new character names and distillery setting. Orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new character names and distillery setting. The applause started before my father finished the sentence, which told me he'd rehearsed the pause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, one hand spread toward the lit bottles behind him like a man presenting the sunrise. "The mind behind every drop of marrow hollow, my son." And the room stood up. 200 people in cocktail dresses and pressed sport coats. The buyers from Halloran Beverage Group at the front table. A food writer from a magazine I actually respected. All of them rising to clap for my brother, who once nearly burned the rickhouse down because he wanted to see what proof looked like on fire. My father leaned in close while the room roared, close enough that I could smell the rye on his breath, and he kept his anchorman smile pointed at the crowd. "Don't you dare make a face," he said quietly. "You're the nose, not the name. The nose is hired help. Hired help doesn't get equity, and it doesn't get a thank you speech. Smile, or you won't get a reference letter when this is done." I didn't make a face. I didn't cry, which I think disappointed him a little, because he wanted a reaction he could later describe to people as proof I was unstable. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the brass ring that held the keys to every barrel warehouse on the property, the keys I'd carried for 10 years. The keys that had worn a pale circle into the lining of every coat I owned, and I set them down on the white tablecloth next to a flute of our own bourbon. They didn't make much of a sound. Nobody noticed over the clapping. Then I walked out the back, past the catering staff and the racked cases of the limited release with my brother's signature printed on the label, and out into the parking lot where my 10-year-old truck was the only vehicle that wasn't leased. Before I tell you what a distiller can do when she finally stops protecting the people who took her name off the door, and I'm going to tell you all of it because I want someone to know the whole thing happened exactly the way I'm saying, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever spent years being the reason a thing works, only to watch somebody else get walked to the front of the room for it? If you have, you already know the specific quiet that lives in your chest at a moment like that. Tell me about it. I read every one of them. My name is Wynne. I'm 29, and for the better part of a decade I was the most important person at a company that made very sure I was invisible. My grandmother, Della, started Marrow Hollow in 1971 in a converted tobacco barn in the hills outside of Bardstown, Kentucky. With a still she welded together from a dairy tank and a lot of stubbornness, she raised me on the catwalk of that rickhouse. By the time I was 9, I could tell you what year a barrel was filled by the smell of the angel's share coming through the staves. She used to hold my face in both hands, hands that smelled permanently of char and corn, and tell me the same thing every time. Whiskey doesn't lie, baby. People lie. Whiskey just tells you what you put into it. When she died, she left the recipes to me, not to my father, who couldn't tell a sour mash from a sweet one. To me. That was the first thing my family decided to forgive me for, and the last. Here's the part that everybody missed, including me for a long time. When my father took the company professional after Gran passed, when he brought in the lawyers and the branding people and decided we were going to be a real label and not a hobby, there was a problem. To distill spirits in this country, you need a federal permit from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. You need a registered dispirits plant, a bond, label approvals, the whole apparatus. And the person whose name goes on those permits, the proprietor of record, the human being the federal government holds personally responsible for every gallon that comes off the still and every dollar of excise tax owed on it. That person cannot have certain things in their past. My father had a tax problem from the 80s he never fully resolved. He had a couple of other things he didn't talk about. When the lawyers ran the paperwork, he didn't qualify. My brother Preston was 20 and already on his second stint of finding himself at a casino in Tunica, so he was out of the question. So they sat me down at the kitchen table. I was 19. I'd just gotten my distilling certification. I was so proud my teeth hurt, and they told me that putting the federal permit in my name was a sacred family trust, that I was the responsible one, that this was how I'd prove I belonged. For 10 years I was the legal proprietor of Marrow Hollow Distilling Company. Every permit, the federal basic permit, the state license, the DSP registration, the operating bond, every single label approval, every cola in the trade was filed under my signature because I designed the labels and I was the only one who understood the federal labeling rules well enough not to get us fined. My father was the CEO on the website. My brother was, eventually, the founder and creative director, a title he got because he was good on camera and looked like what people in New York imagined a Kentucky bourbon man should look like. And I was the master distiller, which everyone in the family treated as roughly equivalent to head of housekeeping. You're going to ask why I stayed. I asked myself that question on a loop for years, usually around 2 in the morning, usually driving home alone from the rick house after a barrel dump while everyone else was at a dinner I wasn't invited to. The honest answer is that they trained me. Not in a single dramatic night. My father was patient, the way water is patient with stone. When I was 8, I won the county fair with a quilt, and he handed it back to me and asked why I wasn't helping Preston with his birdhouse. When I was 12, I made honor roll, and the celebration we had was for Preston getting cut from the baseball team and needing the family. The lesson, repeated 1,000 small times, was that my accomplishments were a kind of selfishness, and that love in our house was something you earned by being useful and lost the moment you wanted anything for yourself. There was one real chance to leave. When I was 26, a famous house up in Frankfurt offered me a job as their master distiller. Real money. My name on real bottles. I had the offer letter in my hand. And my mother sat across from me at that same kitchen table and cried, and told me that walking away would be spitting on Gran's grave, that the family would lose the permits and everyone would lose their jobs. That I was the only one holding it all together, and how could I think about myself at a time like this? My father told me that Halloran was already circling, that a sale was a few years out, and that if I stuck it out and didn't get greedy, I'd be taken care of. I believed him. I turned the job down. I want you to remember that my mother is the one who made me believe that staying was love. She wasn't a bystander to what happened to me. She built the cage and called it a hug. So I stayed, and I built. I rebuilt the distillery floor with a modern compliance system because Preston kept trying to run untaxed batches on the weekends to cover his gambling debts. I caught him 3 separate times moving barrels off the books. And instead of turning him in, I installed an interlock on the production line. It was a simple thing. On paper, by federal rule, the still can't legally run for production without the registered proprietor's authorization. So I built the line so that it physically would not start a bottling or distilling run without my biometric sign-off. Every operating day, the system pinged me for authorization. For 10 years I gave it. I gave it from a hospital waiting room when my best friend was in labor. I gave it from Gran's funeral. I gave it the morning of my own wedding, in a borrowed dressing room, in a dress, with my thumb on a screen. I told myself it was responsibility. It was a leash, and I was the only one who could hear it. What none of them ever understood, because they thought the permits were a formality and the interlock was just one of Wynne's safety things, was that I wasn't an employee they could fire. I was the legal foundation the whole company stood on. They didn't own a distillery. They owned the right to use my federal license until the moment I stopped letting them. And the night of the Halloran Gala, after my father called me the nose and not the name in front of 200 people, I decided I was done lending it out. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the heater ticking and watched the live stream on my phone because of course they were streaming it. $480 million of sale, the biggest craft spirits deal of the year, the press release already written. On screen, my father was clinking glasses with Desmond Okafor, the managing director from Halloran, a careful man with reading glasses pushed up on his head who, I'd noticed during the walkthroughs that week, was the only person in the building who'd ever once asked me a question and waited for the whole answer. The centerpiece of the night was the bottling demonstration. They'd set up the new automated line in the glassed-in production room so the guests could watch the first run of the limited Preston's Reserve come off the conveyor live, bottles filling and capping and rolling past a little brass counter that ticked up the numbers. It was beautiful. I'd designed it. My brother stood next to it in a $3,000 jacket with his arms crossed, accepting compliments for a machine he could not have turned on with a manual and a week to study. My phone buzzed at 5 o'clock, the same notification it had sent me every operating day for 10 years. Production authorization required. Registered proprietor sign-off. There was a green check and a red X. I want to tell you my hands were shaking. They weren't. I'd done the shaking already years before in increments too small to count. I pressed the red X. A second screen came up. Authorization withheld, production hold initiated, and underneath the line I'd written into the system myself, half as a joke, half as a prayer, back when I still thought I'd never need it. Plant non-operational pending license proprietor, notice filed. Because here's the other thing I'd done that afternoon, while my mother was getting her hair set for the party. I'd driven to the FedEx in town and overnighted a notarized letter to the TTB formally beginning the surrender of my permit and resigning as proprietor of record, effective at the close of business. I'd CC the state. I'd CC'd, as a courtesy that was not a courtesy, the compliance counsel for Halloran Beverage Group, whose card Mr. Okafor had handed me during due diligence with a small dry comment about how it was always good to know the actual operator. On the live stream, the bottling line stopped, not gracefully. A bottle froze half full under the filler, bourbon brimming at the lip, and then just sitting there, not pouring, not capping. The conveyor locked, the little brass counters stuck on a number that I could read even on my cracked phone screen. 47. 47 bottles of Preston's Reserve, and then nothing. The room behind the glass went from a low party hum to that specific kind of quiet that happens when a couple hundred people all stop talking within the same 2 seconds and don't know why. My father, bless him, thought it was a glitch. I watched him laugh and wave a hand at the production room, mouthing something to a server, expecting the magic to resume. He tapped the glass like you'd tap an aquarium. Preston went over and started jabbing at the control panel with the heel of his hand, which is genuinely how he tried to fix everything, including relationships. A red banner came up on the big display screen they'd been using for the brand video. I'd configured the system to throw the federal hold notice to any connected display, because if you're going to be shut down, you might as well be shut down legibly. Production hold. No license proprietor on record. Permit surrender pending. My father stopped laughing. I watched his face do the thing I'd waited 10 years to see, the thing where the performance falls off it like a sheet sliding off furniture, and underneath there's just an old man scanning a room full of investors for the daughter he'd thrown out 40 minutes earlier. My phone rang. He'd assigned himself a special place in my contacts years ago, not a name, just the word DAD in capital letters, which now felt like a warning label. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up and said nothing, because I'd learned from him that silence makes the other person fill the air with whatever they're most afraid of. Turn it back on. No hello. His voice was already at a volume he usually saved for the back of the rickhouse. In the background, I could hear the party turning into a different kind of event. Chairs scraping, somebody asking a loud question, the bright artificial tone of people pretending nothing's wrong, while everything is. I know you did this in. I know you rigged that machine. I didn't rig anything, I said. I was so calm it surprised even me. I told you I'm just the nose. The nose can't sign federal production authorizations because the nose got fired about an hour ago. Don't give me that. His breathing was ragged. You sabotaged the line. You put some kind of lock on it. I will have you arrested tonight. I swear to God, I will sue you into the ground. You will never work in this state again. It's not sabotage, I said. It's the law. You can't operate a distilled spirits plant without a registered proprietor. I was the registered proprietor. I resigned this afternoon. As of 5 o'clock, there is no licensed person responsible for that facility, which means every barrel in those warehouses and every bottle on that line is, federally speaking, contraband. I let that sit. It's not me, Dad. It's the TTB. I'd take it up with them, but I wouldn't if I were you. Really wouldn't. I don't care about the TTB. He was screaming now, and I could hear underneath the sound of Mr. Okafor's people starting to murmur the way money murmurs when it smells a problem. I have Halloran in this room. I have $500 million on a table. Fix it. Fix it right now and I'll forget you embarrassed this family. There was a scuffle, fabric against the phone, and then my mother's voice came on, already wet, already pitched into that breathy little tremble she could produce on command, the one that used to undo me. Wynne, honey, please, how can you do this to your brother? This is his night, baby. He's worked so hard. Why would you want to destroy us? Why would you want to destroy your own family? I closed my eyes in the dark of my truck and felt, for the first time in my life, absolutely nothing where the guilt was supposed to be. It was like reaching for a wall in the dark and finding the room had no wall. You watched him hand my whole life to a man who couldn't tell you the mash bill of his own bourbon, I said, and the only thing you cared about was whether the catering was good. You don't get to cry now, Mom. You spent that. You spent all of it years ago. She gasped like I'd slacked her, and then, because she never could hold the act for long, the tremble dropped right out of her voice and she hissed, "We gave you a home. We let you play with your little still. After everything you do this." There it was. Della's whiskey doesn't lie, and neither, eventually, does a manipulator under pressure. My father grabbed the phone back. "The override," he said low and shaking. "Whatever password you put on that machine, you give it to me right now, and maybe I don't have you arrested in front of these people." "There's no password, Dad. It's my thumbprint and my license. You can't subpoena a thumbprint." I started my truck. "Unless you're prepared to sign over 51% of the company to me in the next 5 minutes in writing, in front of Mr. Mistay, Okafor and a notary, the proprietor's going to stay exactly where she is, which is in a Ford in the parking lot leaving. You can't just walk away with the keys to a $500 million company," he said, and I could hear that it had finally landed, the real shape of it, the thing he'd never once considered because he'd never once thought of me as a person who could leave. "I already did," I told him. "Good luck with your buyers. I hear the ones from Halloran really hate surprises." I hung up. I should have driven home. I want to be honest with you about my own stupidity because I think the people who watch this happen to them deserve someone who admits the parts where she got it wrong. I didn't drive home. I drove back. I told myself I wanted my grandmother's barrel thief, the copper one she'd left me, that was still hanging on a nail in the production room, and that was true. But it wasn't the reason. The reason was that some animal part of me still believed that if I stood in front of my father with the truth, he'd finally have to look at it. I forgot the thing Gran tried to teach me about people. When you corner a man who has only ever loved the version of you that's useful, he doesn't apologize. He looks for a way to make it your fault. The party had emptied out into a tense, ugly knot in the tasting room. The press were gone. Most of the Halloran people were gone. But Mr. Okafor was still there, sitting very still with a tablet in his lap, and 2 lawyers leaning over his shoulder, reading something with the careful blankness of people doing math. My father was at the head of the room, and he was, and this is the part I should have read as a warning, calm again. Not the panicked man from the phone, composed. Cufflinks, sympathetic eyebrows. My brother was leaning against the bar with a drink, looking bored, which is how Preston looks right before something he's pleased with. "And here," I said, "let's talk about my permit and my equity." My father turned to me with an expression of such exhausted fatherly grief that for one disorienting second I almost believed I'd hurt him. "Oh, In," he said softly, loud enough for the room. I really truly hoped it wouldn't come to this. And he nodded toward the side door. It opened, and two sheriff's deputies came in with a man in a sport coat behind them I'd never seen, holding a folder. My father had called the county and reported a crime in progress. Wynne Marrow, the man in the sport coat said. They'd actually used my legal name, Grand's name, which I'd kept. We've got a complaint of felony sabotage, theft of trade secrets, and tampering with commercial equipment. We're going to need you to come with us and answer some questions. I didn't tamper with anything, I said, and I heard my own voice climb, and I hated it. I withheld a federal authorization that I am legally the only person allowed to give. That's not a crime. That's the entire point of the permit. Sir, she planted a kill switch on the production line and held the whole company hostage, my father said to the deputy, his voice trembling beautifully, a manila folder open in his hands like a man presenting evidence at a trial he'd already won. We have the logs. She demanded a controlling share to unlock it. It's extortion. We have it in writing. I felt the deputy's hand on my arm, turning me, the cold pinch of a cuff going onto one wrist, and the room, what was left of it, watched. Preston pushed off the bar and walked over, slow, enjoying it. He got close enough that I could smell the bourbon, our bourbon, on his breath. I told you, he said, just for me, almost gentle. Dad's always 3 steps ahead. You thought you could steal my company? Enjoy the county lockup, Sis. My mother sat in the corner by the dead fireplace, and she did not cry this time. She looked at the floor. She looked at the floor the way you look at something you don't want to be a witness to. And somehow that was worse than the crying, because it meant she knew exactly what they were doing and had decided to let it happen. I looked at Mr. Okafor. He hadn't moved. He was still reading the tablet. And I understood, in the cold clarity that comes when you've stopped hoping, that this was their actual plan. They'd never thought they could beat me on the distilling floor or in the permit office, so they were going to beat me in a holding cell, get me arrested, parade me out as the bitter, unstable daughter who tried to burn it all down, and then make my freedom contingent on me transferring the permit back. They turned the safety system I built to stop my brother's fraud into a weapon to frame me for one. What my father didn't know, what he could not have known, because it required imagining that I had an inner life that operated when he wasn't watching, was that I hadn't built the case against him alone, and I hadn't built it that afternoon. 3 months earlier, after I caught Preston moving the 4th set of unrecorded barrels and found the labels, I'd done the thing I should have done years before. I'd made copies of everything and I'd called a number. The man in the sport coat had gotten as far as reading me my rights, and I kept my eyes the whole time on the red federal hold notice still glowing on the big screen behind my father, when a woman stood up from the back of the room. She'd been sitting at the bar the entire night, in a plain dark blazer, nursing a club soda, and I'd assumed she was somebody's +1. She held up a badge and a folded set of papers. "Special Agent Reyes," she said. "TTB, working joint with IRS criminal investigation. Deputy, you can take those off her." She nodded at my wrists. "We've had an open file on this facility for 4 months. She turned to my father and her voice didn't go up at all. If anything, it got quieter, which is somehow always worse. "Gordon Marrow. Preston Marrow. We have a federal warrant. Diversion of untaxed spirits. Mislabeling sourced bulk whiskey as a state-distilled product to inflate inventory ahead of an acquisition. Wire fraud. Tax evasion." She let the deputy uncuff me and looked, almost apologetically, at Mr. Okafor. "We were going to do this Monday, but your closing moved it up." The red banner on the screen, the one my father had been trying to ignore all night, finally got read out loud because Mr. Okafor's compliance lawyer cleared his throat and said into the silence, "That hold isn't a glitch. That's a federal permit surrender. There's been no licensed proprietor on this plant since 5 o'clock, which means..." And he looked for the first time all evening directly at my brother's signature on the limited release label sitting on the bar. "You've been operating, and you were about to sell us. A distillery that legally can't make a drop. And if Agent Reyes is right about the sourced whiskey, you've been selling us inventory that isn't what the labels say it is. $480 million left the room. You could feel it go. There's a bookkeeper at Marrow Hollow, an older woman named Pearl who'd worked for my grandmother and stayed on for me, and who my father kept around because she was cheap and never spoke at meetings. He never once imagined Pearl would do anything but nod. Pearl had every real ledger. The off-book barrels, the Dummel invoices, the bulk whiskey Preston bought from a closing distillery in Indiana and relabeled as ours. She'd kept it all in a banker's box in her sister's basement, because she told me later that Della had once paid her electric bill the month her husband left, and Pearl had been waiting most of her life to repay it. The morning after the gala, she carried that box into Agent Reyes' office herself. The handcuffs that had been on my wrists came off, and within the hour I watched them go onto my father's and then my brother's, and I will not pretend to you that I felt sorry. I felt like a window had been opened in a house that had been sealed shut my whole life. It went fast after that, the way these things do once the structure underneath gives. Halloran walked. The deal collapsed in a single news cycle, with our name in trade publications for all the wrong reasons. Preston took a plea. He was never built for a fight he couldn't charm his way out of, and went to a federal facility in West Virginia for the diversion and the fraud. My father is still fighting his charges, which means he's still spending money he no longer has on lawyers who'll keep him just hopeful enough to keep paying them. The states and the federal government seized the operation. The barrels, the brand, the gleaming bottling line I designed, all of it went to forfeiture and then to a liquidation auction in a cold metal building off the interstate. My mother called me 11 times the week the accounts froze. The 12th time she left a voicemail, and the tremble was back, and she said she had nowhere to go, and that surely after everything I wouldn't let my own mother end up on the street. That family was family. I listened to the whole thing. Then I deleted it, and I blocked the number, and I felt the cleanest I'd felt in years. She built the cage. I wasn't going to climb back in and pull the door shut behind me because she'd started to feel the cold. I went to the liquidation auction. I want to tell you that part because I think you'll appreciate it. I stood in that freezing warehouse with a paddle in my hand, and I bought my grandmother's original still, the one she'd welded out of a dairy tank, the one they'd kept as a heritage display piece in the lobby, for less than the cost of the party that ruined them. I bought the copper barrel thief off its nail. I bought a fermentation tank and 200 empty barrels for pennies. My father was there, out on bond, in a coat that no longer fit the life he had, yelling at the men loading a truck about how those were his. And when he saw me, he stopped. And he did the only thing he knew how to do. He tried to give me an order. He told me to put it down, that it belonged to the family. I picked up Gran's still and I carried it past him, and I didn't say a word, and that was the moment I finally understood what his power had always actually been. It was never strength. It was never even cruelty, not really. It was just money, and the volume of it, and the way a loud enough voice can make a person forget to check whether anything's behind it. Take away the money, and the loud was just a scared old man in a parking lot shouting at movers. I opened my own distillery this spring, in a leased space outside Loretto, with my grandmother still as the centerpiece and a federal permit in my name that no one else will ever sign for. I named it Della's after her because she taught me that whiskey only tells you what you put into it, and I wanted my name to be the truth instead of a thing somebody else got to claim. Pearl runs my books. The first batch is aging in those auction barrels right now, and it's going to be good. I can already smell it coming through the staves on the warm afternoons, the way I learned to as a little girl, before anyone taught me I was supposed to be invisible. We bottled our first release last month. I ran the line myself. I signed the authorization with my own thumb, for my own company, and watched the first bottle fill all the way to the lip and cap clean and roll down the belt, and I thought about my father at that gala, calling me the nose and not the name. I poured a glass from bottle number 1, and I held it up to the light, alone in my own rick house, and it occurred to me, finally, that the nose was the name the entire time. They just couldn't read it until I stopped letting them borrow it. For a long time, I believed the cruelest thing my father ever did was call me the nose and not the name in front of 200 people. It wasn't. The cruelest thing was the slow work of all the years before that. The way Gordon taught me to measure my own worth by how useful I was to him, until I couldn't tell the difference between being needed and being loved. That lie is the reason I stayed a decade. But here's what he never figured out. The same patience he used to wear me down was the patience I used to keep records. Every barrel pressed and moved off the books, every label that said estate distilled over whiskey he'd bought from a dying plant in Indiana, I wrote it down. Not because I was plotting, because my grandmother Della raised me to believe whiskey only tells you what you put into it, and I couldn't stomach putting a lie in a bottle. That's the part I want you to sit with, because it's where everything turned. When Gordon and Ramona cornered me with a sheriff and a folder full of invented charges, they thought they were holding every card. They weren't, because months earlier I'd done the harder, quieter thing and told the truth to Agent Reyes when silence would have been so much easier. Being honest isn't a feeling that comes over you. It's a decision you make on an ordinary afternoon when nobody's watching and there's no pause waiting on the other side. I made it, and it's the only reason the cuffs ended up on the right wrists. I won't pretend the clear thinking didn't matter too. Understanding that a permit in my name wasn't paperwork but leverage, building an interlock no one could bypass by banging on a panel, reading my father well enough to know he'd choose to destroy me before he'd ever apologize. That was 10 years of paying close attention to a family that never once paid attention to me. They mistook my quiet for weakness. It was study. But if you ask me which thing actually carried me out of that room, it wasn't the smarts and it wasn't even the honesty. It was that I kept getting back up. 10 years of giving that 5 o'clock authorization from hospital chairs and funerals, and my own wedding. The morning I walked into a freezing auction warehouse and bought Della Still back for less than the cost of the party that ruined them. The first batch aging in those second-hand barrels right now. Nobody hands you a new life. You build it with cold hands in a leased space while your father screams at the movers in the lot, and you keep building it long after he's gone quiet. Gordon's power looked enormous my whole childhood. It was only money, and money turned out to be the easiest thing in the whole story to lose. The permit was in my name, the work was in my hands. And in the end, so was the only thing that was ever really mine, my own name, on my own bottle, finally telling the truth.